but it all depends on faith in God. That's why nothing is more important.
Let me just say that last event was something that Len and I both attended. And, it's like the Council on Foreign Relations. I used to work in New York City, just up the street from them. And like, it's a very serious state organization. So to hear this preeminent researcher talk like that was kind of fun. Yeah, it was. So what I want to ask you, I want you to like to take it in, but also think, if you were to produce what you heard me read, is this the way you would do it? There's always interpretation, right? Here we go. You have to have a British voice, right?
Which is the greatest commandment in the law?
Jesus replied,
Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
So I love to do that with my students, just show the different ways that these biblical texts, we've got so many of them, whether it's Martin Scorsese or Zeffirelli or whoever, how they interpret these texts. Here's one more. So here's what I want you to do together. Let's take 10 minutes on this. So obviously you're going to say, I want more time. This is the biblical verse we're going to look at next. So don't focus on that. Focus on what goes below. So find somebody next to you. We call this pair share in the business. Find somebody next to you. And if you're in the online, you're going to be put into breakout rooms. You may have 2 or 3 people in the breakout room. What did you learn about this form of self-giving love? In the different ways that from neuroscience, from what Len brought, or from the text as I unfolded it from Jesus. So what did you learn? Share that with one person, and then we're going to take a few minutes to share what we learned, right, with one another. Is that making sense? So pick somebody, say, what did you learn about love? And by the way, whenever I do questions, I always say to people, this is just a suggestive question. Talk about whatever you want to, for goodness sake, right? But we'd like it to be related to what we talked about so far. That's my only guideline. And if you don't know the person next to you, introduce yourself, and that will increase oxytocin, I think, at some level, which we're going to learn about in a minute. All right, we're going to resume. So let's have a couple of people share. We're going to see if we can do this and be super high tech, and also get the online people to do it. Just a few of your conversations, 1 or 2 in the room. Anybody want to discuss or describe what you shared about?
Through ancestral times in different animal species.
Yeah.
And just where did that come from? You know, like we
Yeah.
can trace some of the early beginnings of the water molecule. Now we've got this molecule of love.
Yeah.
And when and why and how.
You want to talk about that now or later? So you might know this guy. Daughter's father. Anyway, then we'll talk about that. Of course, I could talk about it extensively, just like Len could. That's a joke, by the way. But it's a great question. There we go. Yeah.
Well, we learned about love through unconditional love from our moms and pets in our family.
So when I first took psychology in my master's, one of the things I learned is there's 2 different impulses we have. There's ascribed worth and there's achievement orientation. And achievement orientation comes from achieving the ability to get food from the mother's breast. Ascribed worth is when you're held and loved by usually your mother, but any, parental figure. And so I think that's right. That's where we get the sense of, I'm going to call it gift love, but that unconditional gift love. Gift love because you're given it without ever doing anything. Yes.
I think early on, what is love?
Yeah.
Now, you guys need to define that for me.
Mr. Common, man, you got the right question. That's good. I didn't set Lou up to do that. We're gonna get to that. Yeah. Yeah. In some ways, we want to exemplify it before we define it, if that makes sense. A lot of times, okay, we're gonna get philosophical for a second. We get very Platonic. We think of the pure form of love and then how it descends into the world. Sometimes we need to think about how love is actually lived out and then come to our definition. So we're using that form. We're going to look at some of the ways this gets worked out and then go back to a definition of love. Or Nargis has her hand raised. She's one of my students in, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add that I really love the conversation that we had in the breakout rooms where we talk about how to love our neighbors. And then also there's portion, just a small portion, but loves everyone. That's a bigger portion of it, where we had the same kind of ideas where we were from different religions, but we kind of had the same ideas. And the story that she shared with me actually is in my religion, I believe. So it was interesting that how everything connects between religions. So
Thank you, Narcissus. Yeah, you're a Muslim, I know, from the class. So that's really good to hear the interreligious work. We are focusing on the Christian tradition, but very interested in how this connects with other religions. And then, Eve, I'll let you be the last one to share, please.
Okay. Because I do believe in the sacred text, and I was telling Gail some of my story in a couple of seconds. But 1 John 4:8 talks about at the end of that verse, it says, well, the first part is whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. I remember when I worked at a middle school in Pflugerville, Texas, one of my associates, she was a speech therapist, and she was from India. And we would have conversations about lifestyle and how she met her husband. And she was saying how they arranged marriages and that they didn't like consummate the marriage until they got married and all that. And I thought, wow. And she has only been with him her whole life. At that time, I think they were married like 25 years. And we would always have like such a camaraderie, and the love that she was such a patient, like her, you can feel. I'm a very touchy-feely person, and she was like a pillar. And when she came in, I can feel love exuding from her. And so we would always have nice conversations. I said, wow, that is really respectful. I told her, I wish I would have learned that, I'm a recovering love addict, and I've been in treatment and stuff, to learn how to love from the heart and soul versus going to the physical part, which is why some people become addicted to love. But it starts in the heart. That's where love is.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. So there's 6 biblical texts, New Testament texts that we've queued up that connects with neuroscience. We'll see how far we get on those, and I'd be happy to share those later. If you signed up for this, you have my email. Feel free to email me afterward. We really want to have you have time to engage with this instead of our pushing a lot of information. That's good neuroscientifically. So anyway, we're going to get to the next text, which is really interesting. So the first text is a record of Jesus, who taught probably around 33 of the Common Era. This now comes from the early Christian writer Paul, probably mid-50s. He's writing letters, and you can see what those original manuscripts look like in the corner there. He's writing a letter to an early Christian community. When I say church, it so often throws off what people think about when they think about these letters, because yes, I'm part of Bidwell Presbyterian Church, which when you go out, you'll see it, the brick building there. If you're not part of that, that's what we think. So churches exist, right? And I'm part of those. But the early Christian movement didn't have buildings. Didn't have buildings for a couple hundred years. It had houses. So you want to really think about these letters as coming to a kind of revolutionary movement, a different approach to, generally speaking, to start with, the Jewish tradition of which they came, and then adapting it also to some pagan traditions as well. As we also come to this, I just want to say, Len gave you a little bit of his history. So we were both part of this tradition of Christian spirituality. So we're practitioners, you might say, of Christian spirituality as well. So we're not just neutral observers, we're also in the practice. Now, as to whether we love perfectly, both of our wives are here, so you can ask them. And I'm sure the answer will be not perfectly. So just to give you the idea of perspective here. Now let's look at what Paul is saying as a leader gathering these communities together. He's just laid out in this very extensive letter the unknowability of God. It's called a doxology, moment of praise. It's in the chapter 11, verses 33 through 36. That God basically is beyond and above all our understanding. I'm paraphrasing. By the way, chapters did not exist in the original manuscripts, so these are added later. They're helpful for us, but don't take them as part of the original, because then it just flows right into what he says next, which is this: therefore, after this unknowability of God, of the divine as understood through the tradition which he's a part of, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, on the basis of God's mercy, to present yourselves, this is your concrete selves, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable, I want to underline that word for today, your reasonable act of worship. Do not be conformed to this age, to this time, to this period in life, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So I want to just, besides that first point, there are three more points I want to make that are related to this passage in terms of what we're talking about today. Again, the topic of neuroscience and Christian spirituality, or Christian spirituality through love. The first is something we miss when we read this passage in English, because we don't have a distinction between you and all y'all. Now, the Texans that I know do have this distinction. There's you singular, I'm pointing at somebody, and then there's all y'all, which is all y'all, right? And y'all isn't necessarily singular or plural, just so you know. They tell me, like, I have friends in Texas, this is why I'm picking on them. But when we say y'all, I can say, talk to Laura, my wife, and say, y'all, that's fine, right? When I say all y'all, that's all of you. So if you know this in Romance languages, you have a plural and a singular in you, right? If it's Spanish or Italian or French. We don't have that in English. And so we used to. Thou, which some of you might know, was the singular form of you. It got lost. Paul is now using all y'all in this passage. All y'all. I appeal to all y'all, therefore, in this community. Now, why do I make such a big deal of this? Because one of the things we're learning about our formation, even our mental formation, is it's not done individually very well. It's done in community, interpersonally. I'm not saying that individual formation doesn't happen, but neuroscience and other cognitive sciences are showing us that really we are formed in community. We think in community. And this is really difficult for us to understand as individualistic Americans. But Paul is talking to a community, and we might lose that. But that's how the formation happens. It can happen individually, don't get me wrong, but it really happens in community. Second, and by the way, that's why love is so important. Love does not appear in this passage, but it appears in the sense that this is about our brains being changed within a community formed on this basis of love. And I'm going to get to other texts from Paul where you'll see how important love is. Secondly, this is my third bullet point. Paul talks about what is the technical word of metamorphosizing. You know what metamorphosis is, but this is the Greek word behind it. To change, to renew, to transform, right? And Len's going to really unfold this about how this works. And I'll let him obviously do that because that's what he does so well. But this is what Paul is saying. You're not stuck ultimately. There's a way to transform, to be transformed. It's a passive actually, but to be transformed. Your mind is apparently really important. And so like we saw in Jesus's teaching, this idea of the dianoia, here's a related term that Paul uses, the nous. The word for mind in verse 2 is the nous, the thinking component. And he says that this is your logikane, like logical form of worship, which means your ability to transcend and to engage with God or the divine, right? So if I could add all that up, let me just do it one more time. This work of transformation is done in a social unit. It's done and it creates renewal, and that renewal necessarily engages the emotions, and it also engages our mind in our rational facility. So I'm going to turn it over to Len to help you understand how that works a little bit more from the neuroscience. But I wanted to lay that out to demonstrate these connections between the Christian spiritual tradition through Jesus and through Paul, and then the contemporary connections with neuroscience.
So neuroplasticity is something that you've heard about. It has to do with the linking and pruning of neurons to promote adaptation. We are born with neurons starting about 28 days after gestation begins. At this point in most of our lives, we've got about 100 billion neurons. The older you get, the fewer you have. I'm down to about 79,843 billion. The slide here shows the neural network in practice. And one of the things that is true is that we do develop neural networks that are a basis, are to serve us, to adapt, to take care of us. 21 to 28 days after conception, a neural tube develops. And I like to use this cone because it looks a lot like this. It's actually open, and it eventually closes to enclose our spinal cord. At the bottom of that neural tube, we have between 400,000 and 1.2 million neurons being born every hour. And at the bottom of that tube, they're born, and where do they go? They start traveling. And I hope that as I describe this to you, you start to feel a sense of, oh my God, awe. I love to go to the Grand Canyon because I am always awestruck. This awe strikes me more.
Yeah.
And so we have these neurons, they actually move to different parts of the brain. And they do different things. There are about 300 or 400 different kinds of neurons. And the neurons seem to know where they're going and what they need to do when they get there. And it's a fairly rapid process, not just in terms of the birthing of the neurons, but in terms of the movement of the neuron. And that's why your infant likes to take naps. This continues into early childhood. And even now, we have a part of our brain that's producing about 1 neuron per minute. But it just points to the fact that life is continuing. The thing is that the neurons that's just there. Just, as a puzzle, right? One of the things that we need to do is called neuroconsolidation. Those neurons are there, and if they're put to use, they can get neuroconsolidated so we can actually use them. It's the organization of dominant neural networks. Now, what are some of your dominant neural networks? One of your dominant neural networks is devoted to a simple thing like Apple, the word Apple. You have a dominant neural network that's devoted to Apple. It's not a very important neural network, but when I say the word Apple, there's an image that comes along. If I suggest an apple tastes a certain way, you'll sense the taste again. An apple tree will pop in. It's not a really important neural network, but it's there, and you've got millions of those. But you've got some superordinate dominant neural networks as well. And those superordinate dominant neural networks are your values and beliefs. And they're really important to pay attention to because they organize everything that comes in. If you're watching Fox News or MSNBC, you go to each of those entities and you've got dominant neural networks that have to do with your political values. And in each of those experiences, which I ask you not to do after 7 o'clock at night, because and by the way, I'm going to give you an exercise to take the place of that at the end of the workshop, which may save your life.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Keep that in mind. It'll extend your life. If you go to those neural networks, and if you go to those TV networks with your neural networks, an important part of what's going on is that what people are saying is getting put into different bins and linked up. And that's just the way the brain helps to be efficient. The brain is an energy hog. It's using about 20% of your metabolism all the time. 20% of your glucose, 20% of your glycogen, of your oxygen. And in order to not get terribly fatigued, it takes shortcuts. And the shortcuts have to do with these dominant neural networks called values and beliefs. And just pay attention to that because we are just starting to realize how important those values and beliefs are. When we take a look at what's happened over the past few years, as the internet has come along and we become more siloized, then we are able to choose where we fit because we're most comfortable, because there's less energy if I'm a MAGA person going to Fox, if I'm an Antifa going to MSNBC. Does that making sense to you? It's just more comfortable to be in those settings. The problem is that they really take advantage of that and exacerbate and siloize and put bricks and then concrete, reinforced concrete, and then steel around each of those silos. And so we've kind of gotten stuck in those silos, and that's not where we really are going to be able to thrive. And so one of the processes, the neural consolidation process, means fitting things into the pattern that's already there. And most of it takes place while you sleep. It's taking place right now, but you've got too much information coming in right now. After you go to bed tonight, the last things that go into your hippocampus, which is where information is temporarily stored. Your hippocampus, if we have the hand model of the brain, you can go like this, okay? Put your hands together. The hippocampus is your little finger. It's right there about that, and it's held down by what is your amygdala, basically. They're neighbors, and they communicate a lot. And the hippocampus is about the size of your little finger. It's got 4 different segments to it. And one of the things about the hippocampus is really important to pay attention to is where information is going in and temporarily stored. Temporarily stored, meaning several minutes to maybe a full day. But most of the information that's important to you, and it's a small portion of it, is going to get consolidated into those neural networks while you sleep. And that's one of the reasons that sleep is so important. If you're a student, if you're a student of my age, it's really important for me to be serious about my sleep in terms of even taking a nap, taking a 30-minute nap during the day after I've done some real heavy-duty studying. If I take a nap during the day, neuroconsolidation is able to take place, and my learning of what I just read is going to be efficaciously stored. I think what I'm going to do is talk about oxytocin and vasopressin now. Here's the oxytocin molecule, 3D version of it. This is what it does. This is when it's produced in mother and child. The child is responding to the mother's love, to the smell of the mother's breast, to the taste of the mother's milk, and producing oxytocin in the child's body. Vasopressin. This is a good metaphor for vasopressin. It's the older molecule. It's about 600 million years old. Oxytocin came along about 100 million years later. And the thinking is that we needed to have vasopressin first because it's the hormone that helps us develop boundaries, identify the other in a way that allows us to protect ourselves. Now, before mammalian species, back with with slugs that had the early precursors of vasopressin and oxytocin developed 500, 600 million years ago, in order for those animals to survive and eventually thrive, the vasopressin had to be available to protect the cells that were producing, the beings, the entities that were producing. And so they go together. And together they help to develop trauma resilience. In my experience, it's been with adverse childhood experiences and also adult combat trauma. Now, there are many ways in which these two chemicals work together to produce resilience. One of them that we can look at through functional MRI, fMRI. This is an MRI machine in the background and folks looking at the result of the analysis in the foreground. This is another approach that is called magnetoencephalography, which is more recent, known as MEG. And in along the axon there's a little electrical signal that I've already shown you about. It's a tiny electrical signal. What happens when you put electricity through a wire? It produces, at right angles to the wire, a magnetic impulse. This machine that this gentleman is in is able to pick up the electrical magnetic signals from about 50,000 neurons firing together. And so there's an ability that we now have over the last 10 years or so to be able to pick up the magnetic signal from axon bundles flowing through our brains. This is a picture. This is where I worked for many years in St. Louis. It's where the Human Connectome Project started. And this is a picture of those axons that are in our brains, actually going from the top of the brain going down toward the spinal cord. And now we'll take you through, starting at the back of the brain. and taking a look at the axon bundles that are about 50,000 axons in each of these little filaments that you'll see. Each of those filaments there that looks like a hair is actually 50,000 axons. And we're looking from right back here, the posterior part of your skull, now coming around to the right side of your skull over your right ear. We're coming around to the front part of your brain. I hope you're feeling a sense of Grand Canyon plus fog here, because that's what we're looking at. It's amazing to me. And by the way, we're just looking at the axons. The neurons are at the top of those axons. These are just the tails that come out of the neuron. We're coming around to being able to see each of the hemispheres. And the hemispheres are coupled by different entities, but the corpus callosum is the biggest one. It's got about 250 million axons that cross. So there's a lot there. And to the degree that you have a healthy brain, you're using both hemispheres together. And that coordination that's necessary, most of it gets coordinated in real time through the corpus callosum. This is an easier way to look at the corpus callosum, which is there in pink. And one of the things that we now know, going back to our metaphoric corpus callosum, is that the corpus callosum in male brains is smaller than the corpus callosum in female brains. And one of the hypotheses, is just a theory, but it's a testable hypothesis that if you're going into graduate school, I would encourage you to test, is the difference in size. You can see the difference in size between the male and female brain in terms of the corpus callosum, the green fiber bundle there. It's not a huge difference. It's about a 15% difference, but it's there. And it seems to be found across genders for many, many people. And the thinking is, that hasn't been tested yet, by the way, I think it could be tested easily, is that part of that is due to the oxytocin availability during the woman's life. And so, for instance, what we could do is to take a look at not just male, female, but within females who've had an opportunity to give birth, females who've been able to successfully lactate, females who, and so on and so forth, who would presumably have more oxytocin early in life, because most of this growth takes place before about 22, 23 years of age. What can happen to her corpus callosum? And the theory would be that her hemispheres are better connected. And there are some real advantages to that. The most important of which is being a race car driver.
Very useful. Multitasking.
But together, oxytocin and vasopressin lead to secure attachment. On the left side is my very first client, Danny Monday. I met him on February 3rd, 1970. On the right is Ashley and Bert. And they have oxytocin, Danny with Terry, one of his caregivers for many months. And then Ashley and Bert, one of her caregivers for several years. Both challenged children who have secure attachment and therefore can go out into the world more successfully because of how oxytocin and vasopressin has been present based upon a relationship with another mammal. And you don't get, both of those are strong expressions of oxytocin.
Well, I hope your mind really was blown there, because it's pretty amazing.
Oh my gosh.
And so this is a chance to
Consolidate.
consolidate. Exactly. It really is. So we're going to stop giving you information and you can share with one Ms. Lip there. Anyway, that's where we are, of course, and where I teach. There's Bidwell Presbyterian Church, a couple of webpage printouts I've done there, and then material from Science for the Church, which is an interesting organization standing in between, like Len and I are trying to do, the discoveries of science, and particularly Christian ministries and Christian congregations. We have some books that you can buy. Obviously, no pressure because there's not very many of them. So, and there's some you can just look at. I'll be happy to work with you on any questions about any of the materials on the table. So let's do this for 15 minutes. We're at 10:37 on that clock. Let's come back a little after 10:45. And thank you so much for being here.